20-year-old only makes about 30% of what a 20-year-old can make. But your skin has such a huge capacity to make vitamin D that we showed that even 70-year-olds exposed to sensible sun exposure, as I outlined in the vitamin D solution, are able to maintain their blood levels of vitamin D in a satisfactory way.
Well, I noticed that you demarcated a sensible sun exposure. But that could be 20 minutes for somebody, right?
Correct. Like I said, it depends. So if it's 10 a.m. in the morning, say here in Boston, and I know I'm going to get a mild sunburn after being outside from 10 to 11, then I'd probably stay outside from about 10 to 10:30, followed by putting good sun protection on. And like I said, always protect your face. It's the most sun exposed, most sun damaged. It's only 9% of your body surface, so it doesn't provide you with very much vitamin D anyway.
So what do you do to protect your face?
So I use this either a broad rim hat or I cycle, and so I'll put a sunscreen on. A broad spectrum UVB, UVA sunscreen with the SPF of 30.
Now, you also wrote that people who are obese or have a high percentage of body fat also have trouble getting enough vitamin D. Why?
The reason is that vitamin D is fat-soluble, and it loves to be in body fat. In fact, vitamin D is stored in your body fat. And our hunter-gatherer forefathers, being outside every day, were making lots of vitamin D in the spring, summer, and fall. And so they could store it in their body fat. And during the wintertime, as they were using their body fat for an energy source, they were likely releasing vitamin D back into their bloodstream so that they would not become vitamin D deficient. But it turns out that if you have so much body fat, if you're obese, a BMI of greater than 30, a lot of the vitamin D gets into the body fat and basically gets lost and can't get back out. And so we did a study, and we took healthy adults with a BMI of greater than 30 or less than 30, and we either gave them an oral dose of vitamin D or put them in our tanning bed to mimic sunlight exposure. Those with a BMI of greater than 30 only raised their blood level by about 30% to 40% of what a person of normal weight would raise. And so it's well documented that obese people need 2 up to 5 times more vitamin D to both treat and prevent vitamin D deficiency.
That's just remarkable. That even someone who's 30 or 35 pounds overweight would experience the same thing.
That's correct. That the body fat content makes a very big difference. And so it's worthwhile to be sure that you're increasing your vitamin D intake. And maybe we can go through just a little bit about how much is recommended.
Yes, please do.
The Institute of Medicine has now at least realized that the recommendations from 1997 were totally inadequate. Back then, it was recommended that basically all children and adults up to the age of 70 only needed 200 units of vitamin D a day. But in 2011, they came out with new recommendations. They recommend children 1 year of age and older that they need 600 units a day, and adults need 600 units a day until they're the age of 70, in which case they need 800 units a day. I chaired the Endocrine Practice Guidelines Committee, and this is a committee of experts in vitamin D for both pediatric and adult medicine. And we reviewed the literature very carefully and came up with recommendations for children. We believe that 600 to 1,000 units a day is more appropriate for children 1 year of age up to 18, and that adults, 1,500 to 2,000 units a day is what they need to satisfy that requirement. And like I said, if you're obese, you probably need 2,000, 3,000, maybe even 4,000 units of vitamin D a day. I personally take 3,000 units of vitamin D a day from supplements, my diet, and also I follow my own advice and do some sensible sun exposure by cycling, playing tennis, and also gardening.
If you weren't doing those other aspects of sensible sun exposure, would you supplement more?
I have found, because we've done a study and showed that if adults take 2,000 to 3,000 units a day, children 1,000 units a day, they can satisfy their body's vitamin D requirement. Unless, like I said, there are extenuating circumstances, like if they're obese, they're on medications such as prednisone, for example, or anti-seizure medications that destroy vitamin D.
What other medications destroy vitamin D? I'm curious.
Yeah, the major ones are anti-seizure medications like Dilantin, as well as any kind of steroid like prednisone, for example, or cortisol are the major ones. But also AIDS medications can destroy vitamin D. And even the ingredient in St. John's wort can destroy vitamin D.
On page 232 of the vitamin D solution, you say that the presence of calcium and vitamin D3, the body turns down the volume on this fat-storing enzyme. Without adequate calcium and vitamin D available, the body turns up the volume on this fat-storing enzyme. And what you end up with is just that, a higher volume of fat working against everything an individual would like to see happen in his or her body. Explain this, would you?
Sure. So it turns out that that there are several investigators, including my laboratory, has been very interested in looking at the fat cell and to see how responsive it is to vitamin D and what vitamin D is doing in fat. Curiously, we've now found the fat cell has a vitamin D receptor, that the fat cell can activate vitamin D locally, and that active vitamin D does regulate fat cell metabolism. And so if you're vitamin D deficient, the fat cell can become overactive. And we think that by having adequate vitamin D on board, it may keep fat cell metabolism in check and possibly reduce your risk of developing obesity.
That's a big assertion and could be a big discovery. When will you know if the fat lady sings?
Good question. And studies are underway right now. They look very promising, but it's hard to know. But what I can tell you is that typically people that are overweight are often couch potatoes, and they just feel tired and achy, and it makes it difficult for them to really increase their activity. Vitamin D deficiency causes muscle weakness as well as causes this painful bone disease, osteomalacia. And if obese people are vitamin D deficient and have muscle weakness and osteomalacia, all the more reason they're going to be couch potatoes and continue to gain weight. So by them correcting their vitamin D deficiency, often it improves muscle function, they have better stamina, improves mood, and increases their activity level because they have less aches and pains in their bones, muscles, and joints, all to actually, improve their overall health and well-being.
Now, when you're talking about vitamin D, are you really talking about vitamin D3?
Right. So there's a lot of controversy over the past couple of years about the vitamin D2, vitamin D3 controversy, and I'll put it into perspective. So in the vitamin D solution, I point out that the reason that vitamin D2 is the only pharmaceutical form of vitamin D available to physicians is because it predated the FDA. And so the FDA grandfathered vitamin D2. When vitamin D3 was finally easily and cheaply made, nobody wanted to spend the money to get the approval. So vitamin D3 will never be available as a pharmaceutical as a prescription. However, vitamin D3 now is easily made. It is very cheap. And most supplements now contain vitamin D3. Vitamin D2 comes from yeast and also mushrooms. So mushrooms, for example, exposed to ultraviolet light, which is what the mushroom industry is now doing, can be a good source of vitamin D. It's also good for vegans who don't want an animal source because the vitamin D3 that you get in your supplement usually comes from lanolin, from wool sheep. They get the main ingredient from lanolin. So the argument was that if you took vitamin D2, it was less effective than vitamin D3, and possibly if you took vitamin D2, it actually increased the destruction of vitamin D3 in the body, potentially putting you at higher risk for developing vitamin D deficiency. So we did a study, and we took healthy adults, and we gave them 1,000 units of vitamin D2 or 1,000 units of vitamin D3 for about 11 weeks. And we measured their blood levels of 25-hydroxy vitamin D, which is a measure of their vitamin D status. and showed that they were equally bioavailable. Dr. Gordon at Children's Hospital gave vitamin D2